And so now, how did you two meet?
We met through a manager that we both used to have. So.
Yeah, we met here in LA at the Hollywood Holiday Parade.
And Nick was wearing overalls.
Uh-huh. Did you like that or not?
I thought it was kind of funny.
Uh-huh.
For 2 decades, the public version of this story stayed frozen in time. A boy band frontman and a Texas preacher's daughter, married young, filmed constantly, and then gone from each other's lives almost overnight. Everyone remembers the tuna can. Everyone remembers the wedding, the reality show, the sudden divorce that seemed to come out of nowhere. Almost nobody remembers what actually pulled the marriage apart, because for 20 years, neither Nick Lachey nor Jessica Simpson said much about it publicly. They let the tabloids fill in the blanks instead, and the tabloids filled those blanks with speculation that stuck around far longer than the marriage itself did. That silence finally broke in 2026. A chance encounter 35,000 feet over the Pacific forced both of them to talk, at least a little, about a relationship they'd spent 2 decades avoiding in public. And in doing so, Nick gave the clearest account yet of what really ended one of the most watched marriages in reality television history. It wasn't cheating. It wasn't scandal. It was something quieter, and in some ways sadder, than anything the tabloids ever printed. Long before MTV pointed a lens at their kitchen table, Nick and Jessica were simply 2 young people working in the same industry, moving through the same circle of managers, publicists, and award shows that ran the pop music machine of the late 1990s. Nick was the established one. As frontman of 98 Degrees, he'd spent the back half of the decade charting alongside the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, building a career and a level of financial security that was already stable by the time he crossed paths with Jessica at a Hollywood Christmas party. Jessica, meanwhile, was still early in her ascent. She was a teenager with an enormous voice, a deeply religious upbringing rooted in her Texas church community, and a father, Joe Simpson, who doubled as her manager and, by most accounts, as the primary architect of her early career decisions. When they were introduced, she was 18 and he was 25. They talked, they clicked, then drifted apart while Jessica poured her attention into her second album, trying to establish herself as more than a one-hit wonder. Eventually, they found their way back to each other. By the time they got engaged in February 2002, Nick was 28 and Jessica was 22. That 6-year gap mattered more than either of them fully understood in the moment. Jessica has said publicly that Nick was effectively her first serious adult relationship, someone she went to almost directly from her father's house. She was still working out who she was as an adult while simultaneously stepping into a marriage, a rapidly rising career, and a level of fame that very few 22-year-olds have had to manage all at once. They married that October in a lavish Texas ceremony, and in a decision that would carry enormous consequences years down the road. Jessica declined to sign a prenuptial agreement. At the time, Nick was the bigger earner, and by most accounts it was Joe Simpson who advised against a prenup, reasoning that Nick had more to lose financially if the marriage ended. Nobody involved could have predicted just how completely that financial picture would flip, or how expensive that unsigned document would eventually become. In 2003, MTV pitched the couple on a reality series. The original concept was modest, a handful of episodes meant to promote the music albums both were releasing that year, a marketing tool dressed up as entertainment. Nobody involved expected it to become anything more than a minor promotional vehicle. Newlyweds, Nick and Jessica, premiered that August and almost immediately became something else entirely. Audiences organized their weeks around it. The show took mundane domestic moments and turned them into some of the most quoted television of the decade. Most famously the scene where Jessica, holding a can-labeled chicken of the sea, genuinely questioned whether the contents were chicken or fish. That single clip outlived the show, following Jessica around for the rest of her career. What most viewers never fully grasped was how deliberate some of that persona actually was. Jessica has said, in interviews and in her memoir, that she consciously played up a ditzy, wide-eyed image on camera partly because she wanted audiences to like Nick, to see him as the patient, grounded one. She wanted the world to fall for the fairy tale version of their marriage, with Nick as the steady hero. It worked as entertainment. It cost her years of fighting off a reputation as the dumb blonde from reality TV. The show accelerated both careers, but nowhere close to evenly. Jessica's trajectory exploded outward, a fashion line that would eventually become a billion-dollar empire, a starring role in The Dukes of Hazzard, platinum albums, a beauty brand. Within a few years, she wasn't just famous, she was a business. Nick's career grew too, and he's acknowledged the show opened doors music alone likely wouldn't have, introducing him to audiences who related to his easygoing, regular guy presence. But the scale simply wasn't comparable. That widening gap in money, fame, and momentum became a quiet, persistent pressure sitting underneath the marriage, present even in the show's lightest, most comedic seasons. Longtime Newlyweds producer Sue Kalinsky later described Nick and Jessica, in an interview with Complex magazine, as two genuinely different people, confirming that the on-screen friction wasn't manufactured for ratings. It was real, but the show could only ever capture the surface. The deeper strain happened somewhere cameras couldn't reach, in the steadily shrinking amount of time the two of them had left to simply exist as a couple, away from crews and the constant awareness that anything said out loud might end up in an episode. By the show's third and final season, that erosion was impossible to ignore. Every disagreement, every quiet, tense stretch had to be processed in front of a camera crew or shelved entirely, and later kept getting pushed further away as both of their schedules filled with film sets, photo shoots, and endorsement deals that had nothing to do with each other. Outside pressures piled on too. During filming of The Dukes of Hazzard in 2004, reports surfaced about a growing emotional closeness between Jessica and her co-star Johnny Knoxville. Jessica addressed this directly years later, acknowledging a real connection while making clear the distance between her and Nick had already taken hold before that. It wasn't the cause of the breakdown. It was a symptom of one already underway. Newlyweds wrapped in March 2005. 7 months later, in December, Jessica filed for divorce. For years, Nick has maintained that the end of the marriage caught him genuinely off guard. According to accounts from that period, Jessica raised the subject one evening after dinner, telling him she felt they hadn't really been connecting the way a married couple should, and that she believed she wanted a divorce. Nick has described the moment as blindsiding. He said he asked her to sleep on it, hoping a night's distance might soften her certainty. By the next morning, she hadn't changed her mind. That single exchange, more than anything ever captured across 3 seasons of reality television, is close to the real answer behind this story's title. Nick didn't leave Jessica. Jessica, after months of growing emotional distance, built mostly off-camera, made the decision on her own, and Nick was left to process a marriage ending in real time, without the warning he felt he deserved. The filing cited the standard, almost clinical language of irreconcilable differences, a phrase that says almost nothing while technically explaining everything. The money side of this story traces directly back to a decision made before the wedding. When Jessica declined to sign a prenup, it wasn't a calculated financial move. It was an emotional one, made by a 22-year-old who interpreted the very suggestion as evidence Nick didn't fully believe the marriage would last. By the time divorce proceedings began, the financial landscape had completely reversed from their wedding day. Jessica's net worth was now estimated in the tens of millions, while Nick stood at a fraction of that. Because California treats marital assets as community property absent a prenup, that imbalance meant Jessica walked into the settlement as the party with dramatically more to divide. She said publicly, in a televised interview about financial regrets, that skipping the prenup remains one of the biggest financial mistakes of her career. The fashion empire she went on to build eventually reached a valuation reported well into the hundreds of millions, which makes the early setback almost a footnote in hindsight. But at the time it was a painful, real lesson. Nick handled the aftermath without ever publicly criticizing his ex-wife, a restraint that shaped how the industry remembered him. What he did produce, instead of headlines, was music. His 2006 solo album, written openly about the divorce, became the most successful release of his solo career to that point, complete with a companion television special. It stands today as one of the more genuinely honest public responses to heartbreak that mainstream pop music produced during that era. Once the divorce was finalized in June 2006, Nick and Jessica didn't just stop being close. They stopped existing in each other's lives altogether. Not a bitter feud, just a complete absence of contact stretching 2 full decades. Nick has described the relationship as existing in neither category, not friendship, not animosity, just zero contact. In that time, both built entirely new lives. Nick married Vanessa Manillo in 2011, and the couple had 3 children together. He later found a new professional identity as a co-host of Netflix's Love is Blind, a role that let a more thoughtful, grounded version of Nick reach an audience who'd never seen a single episode of Newlyweds. Jessica married former NFL player Eric Johnson in 2014, and the couple had 3 children of their own. Her fashion label kept growing into one of the most commercially successful celebrity-driven brands in American retail history. In 2020, she published a best-selling memoir that finally gave fans a far more honest account of the marriage and divorce than any tabloid ever pieced together. Then, on March 29, 2026, 20 years after their divorce was finalized, Nick and Jessica ended up booked on the exact same commercial flight from Los Angeles to Kauai, Hawaii. Neither had planned it. Both were traveling with their current families. The flight lasted roughly 6.5 hours, which meant there was no quietly avoiding the situation. What happened next depends on which outlet you believe. Early reports from TMZ painted the moment as visibly tense, describing Nick going noticeably red the instant he spotted Jessica, and Jessica switching seats within her group to create distance. Other outlets, including People, described a calmer version, a friendly, low-key exchange between Nick, Jessica, and Nick's wife Vanessa somewhere over the Pacific, described by sources as amicable and relaxed. Nick addressed the encounter publicly about 6 weeks later, on Watch What Happens Live with Andy Cohen. Asked directly whether the rumors were true, Nick confirmed them, calling the whole experience strangely okay. He clarified that while everyone was on the same aircraft, they weren't seated together so much as in the same general section, and that despite the initial shock of seeing each other after 20 years, the atmosphere among both families stayed respectful and cordial for the entire flight. The seating arrangement told its own quiet story about where everyone's lives had landed by 2026. Nick was traveling with Vanessa and their 3 children. Jessica was seated near her mother, Tina Simpson. Jessica's estranged husband, Eric Johnson, along with the 3 children from that marriage, sat separately, in a different section of the plane, reflecting the fact that Jessica and Eric had themselves announced a separation the year before, in January 2025, after 10 years of marriage. Strip away the plane and the headlines, and there's a pattern running through this story that rarely gets acknowledged directly. Jessica was 22 when the marriage began, still constructing her own sense of self, while simultaneously constructing a television persona designed to make her husband look good on camera. She spent years afterward fighting to be taken seriously in an industry that had spent a decade labeling her the dumb blonde from a reality show punchline, a reputation that happened, in large part, because she chose to shrink herself publicly so the marriage would look good to millions of viewers every week. Nick never faced anything close to that same scrutiny. The tabloid culture of the early 2000s was uniquely harsh toward young women in the spotlight, in ways it simply didn't apply to men in equivalent positions. Nick, by comparison, exited the marriage with his public image largely intact, even sympathetic, the steady guy blindsided by a divorce he didn't see coming. That asymmetry explains why their post-divorce paths look so different. Jessica had to actively rebuild how the world saw her, through a fashion empire, a memoir, and years of interviews clarifying who she actually was underneath the character she'd once agreed to play. Nick, by contrast, stepped into his next chapter with relatively little repair work required. At 52, Nick occupies a settled, well-regarded place in the industry. His marriage to Vanessa has held steady since 2011, and their 3 children, Camden, Brooklyn, and Phoenix, are being raised in what Nick describes as a stable, full household. Love is Blind remains one of Netflix's most consistently watched unscripted formats, and Nick's role on it, guiding couples through the exact kind of high-pressure emotional terrain he once lived through firsthand, carries an authenticity audiences clearly respond to. In 2024, on The Ultimatum, Nick used his own divorce as a reference point while counseling a contestant nervous about marriage, admitting candidly that he still carries what he called scars from his split with Jessica. Jessica, at 45, is navigating her own second major transition. Her separation from Eric Johnson became public in January 2025, after 10 years of marriage, and as of 2026 the two are reportedly still working through the process, while prioritizing stable, cooperative co-parenting for their 3 children, Maxwell, Ace, and Birdie. Sources close to the family have described the goal as keeping things as steady and amicable as possible, with both parents focused on their kids first. Jessica has also returned to music after a long absence, and has reportedly begun a new relationship with a Nashville-based musician she's been quietly seeing for a few months, taking things deliberately slow. Strip away the reality show, the tabloid coverage, and the viral tunic and moment, and what's left is a fairly familiar story. 2 people who married young, who were placed under a level of public pressure very few relationships could survive intact, and who grew apart faster than either was fully prepared to admit out loud. Nick has now said, about as plainly as he ever has, that the divorce wasn't something he saw coming or wanted. It was something Jessica decided on her own after concluding the connection had already faded. That, more than any tabloid theory from 2005, appears to be the real answer. What's genuinely striking, 20 years on, isn't the divorce itself. It's everything that came after it. Both of them rebuilt entirely separate lives, found new partners, raised new families, and became far more fully realized versions of themselves than the Newlyweds era ever allowed either of them to be. The 6.5-hour flight to Hawaii wasn't a reunion in any romantic sense, and it wasn't a dramatic blow-up either. It was 2 people, 2 decades removed from a marriage that once played out in front of millions every week, sitting in the same cabin and simply handling it, calmly, respectfully, like adults who'd done the work. That, in the end, might be the most honest ending the story ever got. And it took 20 years, 1 canceled marriage, 1 new marriage, 3 new stepchildren, and a completely unplanned flight to Kauai for either of them to finally say so. What do you think really pulled Nick and Jessica apart? The fame, the pressure, or something neither of them has fully said out loud yet? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the real stories behind Hollywood's most talked about relationships, make sure you're subscribed.